It was one of those nights where the rain didn't fall. It hung in the air like a sigh, slow and heavy, soaking everything it touched without ever really letting go. The kind of rain that makes your socks damp just walking from the bus stop to your front door. But Daniel didn't have a front door to rush to. Not tonight. Not anymore. He stood under the rusted metal awning of a bus shelter on the edge of downtown Portland, Oregon, his bike leaning against the bench with a broken chain dangling like a dead snake. His hands were raw from trying to fix it with numb fingers and a bent multi-tool he'd bought at a gas station 2 years ago, back when he still believed he could fix anything if he just tried hard enough. That belief had worn thin like the soles of his boots. At 42, Daniel wasn't old, but he felt it. Not in his bones, though those ached from sleeping on couches and bus benches, but in his spirit. He'd spent the last decade running from one version of himself to another, each one a little more tired than the last. He used to deliver food on an electric scooter, then switched to bikes when the gig apps changed their pay structure. Now he was back to pedal power, hauling packages through traffic and puddles for barely enough to cover rent on a room he shared with 2 strangers who never spoke to him. His jacket was soaked through. Water dripped from his hair onto the collar of his shirt, cold and insistent. He checked his phone, 11:47 p.m. No new orders. No messages. Not even a spam email. Just silence. And in that silence, something cracked open inside him. He looked up at the sky, gray and low, and without thinking, he said it out loud. "If you're really there, what makes you angry?" "Because I keep messing up," he didn't shout. He didn't fall to his knees. He just said it like you'd ask a friend why the coffee machine broke again. There was no lightning, no voice from the clouds, just the hiss of tires on wet pavement and the distant hum of a late-night diner sign flickering down the street. But then, something shifted. Not outside. Inside. A memory surfaced, clear as if it had happened yesterday. He was 8 years old, sitting on the porch of his grandmother's house in New Mexico. She was shelling peas into a blue bowl, her hands moving slow and sure. He'd asked her, "Abuela, does God get mad at us when we lie?" She didn't look up. Just kept shelling. "Mijo," she said, "God doesn't rage like men do. But he grieves. He grieves when we forget we're all connected, like branches on the same tree." Daniel hadn't thought about that moment in 20 years. Yet there it was, rising up through the noise of his exhaustion like a quiet bell. He leaned his head back against the cold metal of the shelter and closed his eyes. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about how to get through the next hour or how to avoid the shame of another missed call from his daughter. He was just present. And in that presence, a strange calm settled over him. Not happiness, not relief, but something deeper. A kind of stillness that felt like being seen. He remembered the last time he'd spoken to Lily. She was 14 then. He'd shown up unannounced at her school hoping to surprise her, but she'd looked at him like he was a stranger who'd wandered into the wrong life. "You don't get to disappear and then act like you're still my dad," she'd said, her voice flat, eyes dry. He'd tried to explain. About the relapse, the job loss, the months he spent sleeping in his car, but she just turned and walked away. No anger, no tears, just distance. And that hurt more than shouting ever could. Now standing in the rain, he realized something. He hadn't been asking for forgiveness. He'd been asking to be excused. Big difference, the rain slowed. The streetlights cast long, watery reflections on the pavement. A bus rumbled past, empty except for the driver, who gave Daniel a small nod through the windshield. Daniel nodded back. Small kindnesses. They mattered more than he used to think. He pulled his hood tighter and crouched beside his bike. This time, he didn't fight the chain. He just studied it, noticing how one link was bent, how the grease had washed away. He didn't need to fix it right now. He could walk it home, or call a friend, if he had one who'd answer at midnight. But maybe that was part of it too. He'd stopped reaching out, told himself he didn't want to burden anyone, but really he was afraid they'd say no, or worse, say yes, and then he'd have to face the mess he'd become. He stood up and took a deep breath. The air smelled like wet concrete and distant pine, clean, real. And then quietly, almost to himself, he said, "Okay, I hear you." He didn't know if God was listening, but for the first time in years, he was listening. To himself, to the world, to the quiet ache beneath all his excuses. He started walking, pushing his broken bike beside him. Each step felt heavier than the last, but also clearer, like he was shedding something with every block. Not guilt. Guilt was too loud. This was quieter. Regret, maybe, or responsibility, the kind that doesn't crush you but calls you back to yourself. As he passed a 24-hour laundromat, he saw an older man sitting on a folding chair by the window, folding a stack of shirts with careful hands. Their eyes met for a second. The man smiled. Just a small lift of the lips, nothing more, but Daniel felt it like a hand on his shoulder. He kept walking. By the time he reached his neighborhood, a row of low brick buildings with flickering porch lights and overflowing recycling bins, he wasn't thinking about his daughter, or his failed relationships, or the rent due next week. He was thinking about that bus driver's nod, that stranger's smile, his grandmother's hands shelling peas, and the question he'd asked into the rain. What makes you angry? Maybe it wasn't about anger at all. Maybe it was about love. Love that hurts when it's ignored. Love that watches people choose isolation over connection, pride over humility, noise over truth. He got to his building, climbed the creaky stairs to the 3rd floor, and unlocked his door. The room was dark, cold, bare except for a mattress on the floor, a hot plate, and a duffel bag in the corner. No photos, no books, nothing that said someone lives here. But tonight, that felt wrong. He turned on the single lamp by the window and sat on the edge of the mattress. He didn't check his phone, didn't scroll, didn't numb himself with noise. He just sat, and for the first time in a long time, he let himself feel it all. The shame, the loneliness, the hope that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to start again. Not with grand gestures, not with promises he couldn't keep, but with one honest choice: to stop pretending he was fine when he wasn't, to stop hiding behind busyness and blame, to see people, not as obstacles or saviors, but as fellow travelers just as lost and longing as he was. He pulled out a notebook from his backpack, mostly used for delivery addresses, and flipped to a blank page. At the top, he wrote, "What I'm learning." Then slowly he wrote, "It's not the mistakes that break us. It's refusing to look at them." He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Maybe another flat tire, maybe another rejection, maybe nothing would change at all. But something had already changed inside him, not because of a miracle, not because of a voice from the sky, but because for once he'd stopped running long enough to ask a real question and stayed still enough to hear the answer in the quiet. Outside, the rain finally stopped. A sliver of moon broke through the clouds, casting a pale light across the wet streets. Somewhere a dog barked. A car door slammed. Life went on, and Daniel, sitting in his small empty room, felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not hope exactly, but the space where hope could grow. He closed the notebook and lay back on the mattress, staring at the ceiling. He didn't fall asleep right away. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't mind the silence, because in that silence he wasn't alone. He was just human. And maybe that was enough. The next morning, Daniel woke up before his alarm. Not because he'd slept well, he hadn't, but because something inside him felt unsettled, like a stone had been turned over in his chest, and now he could see what had been hiding underneath. He sat up slowly, the thin blanket slipping off his shoulders, and looked out the window. The sky was pale gray, the kind of light that comes just before the world fully wakes up. Quiet. Waiting. He didn't reach for his phone right away. That was new. For years, the first thing he did was check for messages, orders, missed calls, anything to prove he was needed, that he mattered. But today, he just sat there, listening to the hum of the old radiator and the distant sound of a garbage truck 2 blocks over. He remembered what he'd said last night under the bus shelter. The question, the silence that followed, and that strange, quiet feeling that had stayed with him like a second skin. He got up, made instant coffee in the chipped mug he'd found behind a cafe dumpster last winter, and sat by the window again. As he sipped the bitter brew, he noticed things he usually ignored. The way the steam curled from the cup, the neighbor across the alley hanging laundry with careful hands, the pigeon pecking at a crumb on the fire escape. Small things, ordinary things. But today they felt alive, connected. He wasn't sure why. Later, on his first delivery of the day, a package of vitamins to a woman who barely opened her door, He caught himself doing something unusual. Instead of turning away the second the box was in her hand, he paused. "Have a good one," he said, not as a reflex, but like he actually meant it. She blinked, then gave a small nod. "You too." It was nothing. Less than nothing, really. But it stuck with him all the way to the next stop. At a coffee shop downtown, he waited in line behind a man in a suit who was yelling into his phone about a delayed flight. When it was his turn, the man snapped at the barista. "I said oat milk, not almond. Do I look like I can't speak English?" The barista, a young woman with tired eyes and a name tag that read Tina, flinched but said nothing. She remade the drink in silence. Daniel watched. He saw how her shoulders tightened, how she avoided eye contact. He saw the man grab his cup without a word and walk out, already dialing another call. And then Daniel did something he hadn't done in years. He stepped forward and said, "Hey, that wasn't cool." Tina looked up, surprised. "I know it's not my business," he added quickly, "but you didn't deserve that." She gave a small, tired smile. "Thanks. Happens more than you'd think." He ordered his usual black coffee, no sugar, no cream, and as he waited, he thought about how often he'd been that guy. Not yelling maybe, but impatient, distracted, treating people like background noise instead of human beings with their own storms inside. He remembered a time, years ago, when he'd lied to his sponsor about using again, not because he wanted to deceive him, but because he didn't want to disappoint him. He told himself it was to protect the other man's feelings. But really, it was pride. He didn't want to look weak. Didn't want to admit he was still struggling. Now, standing in that coffee shop, he realized that kind of lie wasn't just about him. It hurt the other person, too, because it robbed them of the chance to help, to connect, to be real together. He took his coffee and walked outside. The sun had broken through the clouds, weak but persistent. He sat on a bench near the park and pulled out his notebook. "Flip to a fresh page," wrote what I saw today. Then, people hurting people because they're hurting themselves. And me, I've done it too. He didn't write it with shame. More like recognition, like seeing an old scar and finally understanding how it got there. That afternoon, while waiting for a package to be ready at a print shop, he overheard two women talking. One was complaining about her neighbor who never took her trash bins in. "It's like she thinks the rules don't apply to her," the woman said, voice sharp with irritation. The other woman nodded. "Some people just don't care about anyone but themselves." Daniel looked down at his shoes. He thought about the times he'd left his own bins out for days because he was too tired or too numb to move them. He'd told himself it was no big deal. But now he wondered, what if someone saw that and felt disrespected? What if it made their day a little heavier? It wasn't about the bins. It was about the message. I matter more than you do. And maybe that, more than anything, was what grieved the heart of something greater than himself. Not the big sins people talked about in sermons, but the tiny daily choices to turn away from each other, to act like we're alone in the world. That evening, back in his room, he dug out an old interview he'd saved on his phone, a rare, quiet conversation with Keanu Reeves from years ago. He'd always liked how the man spoke, slow, thoughtful, never trying to impress. In the clip, someone asked him what he believed about humanity. Keanu paused, then said, "We're all we've got." That's it. "We're all we've got." Daniel played it twice. The words settled in him like stones in a river. Smooth, heavy, true. He closed his eyes and thought about his daughter. Not the version he wished she was, understanding, forgiving, but the real her. Guarded, hurt, trying to protect herself from more pain. He hadn't earned her trust, and he wouldn't get it by showing up with flowers or apologies. He'd get it, if he ever did, by being consistent. By showing up again and again without expecting anything in return. But first, he had to stop lying to himself. The next morning, he called his sponsor. Not to report a win or ask for help, but to say, "I lied to you 2 years ago. I was using, and I told you I wasn't. I'm sorry." There was a long pause on the other end. "Then thank you for telling me now." That was it. No lecture, no anger. Just gratitude for the truth. Daniel hung up and felt lighter, like he'd dropped a backpack full of rocks he didn't know he was carrying. Over the next few days, he started paying attention, not just to what people said, but to what they didn't say. The way the grocery clerk's hands shook slightly when she handed him change, the teenager on the bus who stared out the window with eyes too old for his face. The old man feeding pigeons in the park, talking to them like they were old friends. He began to see a pattern. Everyone was carrying something. And the ones who lashed out, who shut down, who acted like they had it all together, they were often the ones hurting the most. One rainy afternoon, he delivered a package to a small apartment above a laundromat. The woman who answered the door had red eyes and a tissue in her hand. She signed for the box without speaking. As he turned to leave, he hesitated, then said, "Rough day?" She looked surprised, then nodded. "My dog passed last night. I'm so sorry," he said. And he meant it, not as a script, but from his own place of loss. She gave a small, watery smile. "Thanks for saying that. Most people don't even notice." He walked away feeling like he'd been given a gift. Not because he'd helped her, but because she'd let him see her pain, and in doing so, reminded him that he wasn't the only one walking around with a hole in his chest. That night, he wrote in his journal, "Maybe what angers God isn't our brokenness. It's when we pretend we're not broken, and then treat others like their brokenness is a flaw instead of a shared condition." He thought about the man in the coffee shop again. Not to judge him, but to wonder, what pain was he carrying that made him snap at a stranger? What loneliness made him believe kindness was weakness? Daniel didn't have answers, but he was starting to ask better questions. He also started noticing his own habits. The way he'd scroll on his phone during breaks just to avoid feeling anything. The way he'd make excuses for not calling his mom. The way he'd tell himself tomorrow when it came to making things right. But now, when those thoughts came, he'd pause, take a breath, and ask, "Is this helping me connect or pushing me further away?" It wasn't dramatic. There were no lightning bolts or choir songs. Just small choices made quietly one after another. One evening, he saw a man arguing with a bus driver over a missed stop. Voices rising. Tension thick. Daniel almost walked past, his usual move, but something stopped him. He stepped closer and said, calm but firm, "Hey man, it's okay. Buses run late all the time. Let's just wait for the next one." The man turned angry at first, then saw Daniel's face. Not challenging, just present. He exhaled sharply, muttered something, and stepped back. The bus driver gave Daniel a grateful look. Later, walking home, Daniel realized he hadn't done it to be a hero. He'd done it because he finally understood. Every time we choose patience over pride, kindness over convenience, we're stitching the world back together, one thread at a time. And maybe that's what it's all about. Not being perfect, not never failing, but refusing to let failure make us cold. He got back to his room, made tea this time instead of coffee, and sat by the window again. The city lights flickered below. Somewhere, someone was laughing. Somewhere else, someone was crying. He didn't try to fix any of it. He just chose in that moment to care. And that, simple as it sounds, felt like the beginning of something real. The court order had been clear. 60 hours of community service, completed within 3 months. Daniel hadn't argued. He'd shown up at the downtown outreach center on a Tuesday morning, damp from the walk and wearing his least worn jacket, unsure what to expect. He figured he'd sweep floors, take out trash, maybe stack canned goods, anything to check the box and move on. What he didn't expect was Marisol. She was in her late 60s, with silver hair pulled into a loose bun and hands that moved like they'd spent a lifetime doing things that mattered. She ran the kitchen at the center, not as a volunteer, but as someone who treated it like sacred ground. Every pot was scrubbed clean, every shelf labeled, every meal served with a look that said, "I see you." Daniel was assigned to help prep lunch, chopping onions, peeling potatoes, washing trays. Simple work, but Marisol didn't treat it like a chore. She moved through the kitchen like she was conducting a quiet symphony, humming old songs under her breath, pausing to adjust a wobbly table leg or refill the salt shakers without being asked. At first, Daniel kept his head down. He didn't want conversation. He didn't want to be seen as the guy doing court hours. He just wanted to disappear into the rhythm of the work. But Marisol had a way of making silence feel like an invitation. On his third day, she handed him a paring knife and a bowl of apples. "Core these," she said. "Save the peels. We'll dry them for tea." He nodded and got to work. The kitchen was warm, filled with the smell of simmering beans and garlic. A few other volunteers moved around, some regulars, Some like him doing hours, but Marisol was the steady center, the quiet force that held it all together. Halfway through the apples, he noticed her watching him. Not in a suspicious way, more like she was reading a story he didn't know he was telling. "You always cut so carefully," she said finally. He shrugged. "Don't want to waste anything." She smiled just a little. "Most people rush. They think speed is kindness, but sometimes slowness is the real gift." He didn't know what to say to that, so he kept cutting. Over the next few weeks, something shifted. Daniel started showing up early. Not because he had to, but because the kitchen felt safe. Not in the way a locked door feels safe, but in the way a deep breath feels safe. Like you can finally stop holding everything in. He watched how Marisol treated everyone the same. The man who came in reeking of alcohol and shame, she handed him a plate and said, "Sit, you look tired." The teenager who wouldn't make eye contact, she asked about his shoes. Genuine curiosity, not pity. The woman who cried quietly in the corner, Marisol brought her a cup of tea and sat beside her without saying a word. No sermons. No judgments. Just presence. One rainy afternoon, the power went out in the building. The kitchen fell into dim gray light. Volunteers started grumbling. Lunch would be late, the fridge might spoil. The schedule was ruined. But Marisol just lit a few candles she kept in a drawer, pulled out a pot of cold soup from the back, and started ladling it into bowls. "Warm enough," she said. And full is full. People lined up anyway. And as Daniel handed out bowls, he saw something he hadn't expected. Gratitude. Not the loud kind, but the quiet kind. The kind that shows up in a nod, a thank you that lands like a stone in still water. Later, as they cleaned up by candlelight, Marisol turned to him. "You're not just here for the hours, are you?" He froze, sponge in hand. I don't know." She wiped her hands on her apron. "It's okay if you don't. Sometimes we show up for one reason and stay for another." He wanted to ask her what she meant, but the words stuck in his throat. A few days later, he found himself talking to her while peeling carrots, not about his court order, not about his past, but about his daughter, about how he missed her laugh, about how he didn't know how to start over when the damage felt permanent. Marisol listened. Really listened. Not like she was waiting to fix it, but like she was holding space for it to just be. When he finished, she didn't offer advice. She just said, "You think God is angry at you for leaving?" He looked down. Maybe, or disappointed. She was quiet for a moment. "Then God doesn't rage at broken people. He grieves when broken people refuse to reach out, or worse, pretend they're not broken." The words hit him like a wave. He'd spent years trying to look strong, to act like he had it under control. Even when he was sleeping in his car, even when he was using again, he told himself he was handling it. But all that pretending hadn't protected anyone. It had just built walls. Marisol rinsed a pot and set it on the rack. "Pride isn't thinking you're better than others. It's thinking you have to do it all alone." He didn't respond. But that night, lying on his mattress, he replayed her words over and over. They didn't feel like a lecture. They felt like a key. The next week, something small happened that changed everything. A new man came into the center. Thin, jittery, eyes darting like he expected someone to yell at him any second. He stood by the door, unsure. Most people ignored him. But Marisol walked right over, handed him a towel, and said, "Wash your hands. Lunch is almost ready." The man hesitated. I don't have any money." "We don't charge," she said gently. "Food's free. Dignity's free, too." The man's shoulders dropped just a little. He followed her to the sink. Daniel watched from across the room, and in that moment he saw it, not charity, but kinship. Not "I'm helping you," but "we're in this together." Later, as they stacked chairs, he asked Marisol, "How do you do it? Stay kind like that even when people are difficult?" She paused. "I don't do it. I let it move through me. Kindness isn't something I produce. It's something I allow." He frowned. "What's the difference?" "If it's mine," she said, "I get tired. If it's not, if it's just flowing through me like water through a pipe, then it never runs out." He thought about that all the way home. He'd always seen kindness as a limited resource, something you gave when you had extra. But what if it wasn't? What if it grew the more you used it? The next day he brought an extra sandwich from the deli next door. He didn't tell anyone. He just left it on the counter with a note. "For whoever needs it." Marisol saw it. Didn't say anything. just gave him a look that said, "I see you." As the weeks passed, Daniel started noticing things he used to miss. The way the man who always sat in the back corner saved half his meal for his dog. The way the woman with the walker always made sure the door stayed open for the next person. The way people said bless you when someone sneezed, even if they didn't know each other. This place wasn't perfect. People argued. Dishes got broken. Someone stole a coat once. But underneath it all was a current of care. Quiet, steady, real. One evening after closing, Marisol asked him to help carry bags of donated bread to the storage room. As they walked, she said, "You've been different lately." "How so?" "You look people in the eye now." He hadn't even realized he'd stopped doing that. Years of shame had taught him to keep his gaze low, to make himself small. But lately, he'd been looking up. "Why do you think that is?" she asked. He thought for a long time. "Because I don't feel like I have to hide anymore." She nodded. "That's the first step. Not being fixed. Just being honest." They reached the storage room. He set the bags down. "Do you believe God talks to people?" She smiled. "Not in words. Not usually. But in moments, in people. In choices, like you." She laughed softly. "Especially not like me. But maybe, through me. Through all of us." He stood there in the dim light of the storage room and felt something loosen in his chest. He wasn't being saved by a miracle. He was being saved by a kitchen. By a woman who peeled apples slowly. By strangers who shared their last cigarette. By the simple act of showing up and saying, "Me too." On his last required day of service, he showed up early like always. Marisol was already there, stirring a pot of stew. "You don't have to stay," she said, though her eyes said otherwise. "I know," he replied. "But I want to." She handed him an onion. "Then peel this," he did. And as the tears came, from the onion or something deeper, he wasn't sure. He realized he wasn't alone anymore. Not because someone had fixed his life, but because he'd finally stopped pretending he had to do it by himself. And in that kitchen, with the smell of garlic and the sound of rain on the roof, he understood what Marisol had been trying to show him all along. The divine isn't found in perfection. It's found in the willingness to be human, together. He didn't plan it. There was no grand speech rehearsed in the mirror, no carefully chosen outfit, no promise of a new car or a clean record. He just woke up one Saturday morning with a single thought in his head. I need to see her. Not to fix things. Not to explain. Just to be there. His daughter, Lily, was 16 now. He hadn't seen her in over 2 years. Not since that day outside her school when she walked away without looking back. He'd sent letters. She never replied. He'd called on her birthday. Her voice was polite, distant, like he was a telemarketer who'd caught her at a bad time. Still, he kept trying. Not because he expected anything, but because stopping would have meant accepting that he'd lost her for good, and he wasn't ready to do that. This time, he didn't show up at school. He didn't call first. He just went to the address he'd gotten from an old friend of her mom's, a small apartment on the east side near the community college. He stood across the street for nearly 20 minutes, heart pounding like he was about to walk into a job interview he hadn't prepared for. He wore clean jeans, a plain gray shirt, and his least scuffed boots. No cologne, no flowers, just himself. When he finally crossed the street, his legs felt like they belonged to someone else. He knocked softly. The door opened a few inches, chain still on. Her eyes appeared in the gap, older than he remembered, guarded but unmistakably hers. She froze when she saw him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then she unhooked the chain and opened the door all the way. She didn't smile, didn't frown, just stood there, arms crossed, waiting. "Hey," he said, voice quieter than he intended. "Hey," she replied. He didn't step forward, didn't try to hug her. "I know I shouldn't just show up like this, but I needed to see you." She studied him like she was trying to decide if he was real or just another ghost from her past. "Why now?" He took a breath. "Because I finally stopped lying to you, to myself, to everyone. And I thought, maybe that matters." She didn't answer right away. Then with a small sigh, she stepped aside. "You can come in, but I've got class in an hour." The apartment was small but tidy. Posters on the wall, poetry quotes, a black and white photo of a mountain, a calendar marked with study sessions. A life built without him. He sat on the edge of the couch, hands on his knees, careful not to touch anything. She sat across from him in a worn armchair, legs tucked under her. "So," she said, "what's the truth you've been hiding?" He looked at her, not at the floor, not at his hands, but right at her. "I was selfish. I thought my pain was the only one that mattered. I disappeared because I was ashamed, and instead of facing it, I ran. And in doing that, I hurt you more than anyone." She didn't flinch, didn't cry, just nodded slowly. "Yeah, you did. I'm not asking you to forgive me," he said quickly. "I don't expect that, I just wanted you to know I see it now." All of it. She was quiet for a long time. Outside, a dog barked. A bus rumbled past. The clock on the wall ticked loud in the silence. Then she said, "Do you still use?" "No," he said. "Not in 3 years. Not perfectly. Some days are harder than others, but I haven't touched it." She nodded again. "Mom said you were back on your feet. Delivering packages." "Yeah. Do you like it?" "It's honest work," he said. "And it keeps me moving." She looked down at her hands. "I used to wonder if you even thought about me." "I thought about you every day," he said. "But thinking wasn't enough. I had to change. And I'm still learning how." She met his eyes again. "Why now? Why not a year ago, or 2? "Because I was still pretending," he admitted. "I thought if I just stayed clean and got a job, that would be enough. But it's not. You don't need a fixed dad. You need a real one." Something shifted in her expression then, not softening exactly, but opening, like a door left ajar on a cold day. They talked for almost an hour. Not about the past mostly. She told him about her classes. She was studying to be a social worker. Said she liked helping people who felt invisible. He didn't tell her how much that reminded him of Marisol. Didn't tell her how proud he was. He just listened. When it was time to go, she walked him to the door. "You can text me," she said, almost like an afterthought. "Just not too much. And no promises you can't keep." "I won't," he said. She gave a small nod. "Okay." He turned to leave, then stopped. "Lily," she looked up. "Thank you." "For letting me in." She didn't say anything. Just closed the door gently behind him. He walked home in a daze. Not elated, not relieved, but changed. Like he'd carried a weight for so long he forgot what it felt like to set it down, even just for a moment. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay on his mattress, staring at the ceiling, replaying every word, every pause, every look. And then, sometime after 2 a.m., he drifted off and dreamed. In the dream, he was standing in a vast field under a clear sky. All around him, people walked in every direction, but no one spoke. Everyone wore masks, smooth, featureless, painted with fake smiles or blank stares. He reached up and touched his own face. It was covered too. Then, one by one, people began to remove their masks. Not dramatically, not for applause, just quietly. A woman took hers off and breathed deeply, like she'd been holding her breath for years. A teenager dropped his on the ground and walked away without looking back. An old man knelt and helped a child pull hers free. Daniel watched, heart pounding. He wanted to take his off, but fear held him. What if they see the mess underneath? What if they walk away? Then he saw Lily in the distance. She wasn't wearing a mask. She looked right at him and held out her hand. He reached up. His fingers trembled. And with a slow, deep breath, he pulled the mask away. The air hit his face like cool water. He gasped, not from pain, but from relief. He was just himself, flawed, scarred, human, and no one ran. They just kept walking. Some nodded. Some smiled. Some kept their eyes down. But no one judged. No one mocked. They were all just breathing. He woke up with tears on his cheeks, not sad tears, not happy ones. The kind that come when something deep inside finally cracks open. He sat up and reached for his notebook. The streetlight outside cast long shadows across the page. He wrote, "The wake-up isn't a thunderclap. It's a whisper that grows louder the more you listen. What wounds the heart of love isn't our brokenness. It's our refusal to be seen in it." He thought about God's anger again, not as fire and punishment, but as sorrow. Sorrow for how often people choose masks over connection, pride over honesty, isolation over the messy, beautiful truth of being human together. He thought about Lily, about how she didn't need him to be perfect. She just needed him to be real, and maybe that was the point all along, not to earn forgiveness. Not to prove he'd changed, but to stop hiding. The next morning, he sent her a text. Just 3 words, "Good luck today." No emoji. No follow-up. Just space. She didn't reply right away. But 2 hours later, a single message came through. "Thanks. That was enough." Over the next few weeks, he kept his word. He texted her once a week, sometimes just a weather update, sometimes a memory. "Remember that ice cream place by the park? It's still there." Never asking for anything in return. She didn't always answer. But when she did, her replies got longer, less guarded. One afternoon, while delivering a package near her neighborhood, he saw her walking with a friend, laughing at something. He didn't call out, didn't wave, just watched for a moment, then turned and walked away, happy just to know she was okay. Back at the outreach center, where he now volunteered on his own time, he helped Marisol serve lunch. She didn't ask about Lily. She just handed him a ladle and said, "The beans need stirring." He smiled. "Yes, ma'am." Later, as they washed dishes side by side, she said, "You look lighter." "I feel like I can breathe," he admitted. "Good," she said. "Because the world needs people who can breathe and help others do the same." He thought about that all week. He started noticing how often people wore invisible masks in everyday life. The coworker who said, "I'm fine," with red eyes. The stranger who snapped at a cashier, then looked ashamed. The friend who posted perfect photos online while struggling alone at night. And he realized, the real rebellion isn't being loud. It's being honest, so he tried small things. Telling his landlord he was short on rent this month instead of making excuses. Admitting to a fellow courier that he was having a hard day, saying "I don't know" instead of pretending he had answers. Each time he expected rejection. But more often than not, people leaned in, shared their own struggles, connected because honesty is contagious. One evening, he sat on his fire escape, watching the city lights flicker on. He thought about the dream, the field, the masks, the breath of freedom. And he understood. The divine doesn't want perfection. It wants presence. It wants us to show up, scars and all, and say, "This is me. Take it or leave it." But not in pride. In humility. Not "I'm broken, so don't expect anything," but "I'm broken and I'm still trying, and maybe you are too." That night he wrote Lily a letter. Not to send, just to write. He told her about the dream, about the masks, about how sorry he was for hiding, and how if she ever wanted to talk, really talk, he'd be there. No pressure. No expectations. He folded it and put it in his drawer. He didn't need to send it. The act of writing it was enough. Because the wake-up wasn't about fixing the past. It was about living honestly in the present. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was finally doing that. Months passed, and life didn't change in big, dramatic ways. There were no sudden windfalls, no viral moments, no grand reunions under golden sunsets. But something quieter happened, something deeper. Daniel began to live like a man who'd stopped running. Not because he'd reached a finish line, but because he'd finally learned to walk with his eyes open. He still delivered packages, still woke before dawn, still pedaled through rain and traffic and summer heat that made the pavement shimmer like a mirage. But now his bag held more than just boxes. Tucked in the side pocket were extra gloves, wool ones for winter, thin cotton for spring, that he'd leave on benches or hand to someone shivering at a bus stop. Not with fanfare, just a quiet, "Here, you might need this," and then he'd keep moving. He didn't do it to feel good about himself. He did it because he finally understood. Kindness isn't a transaction. It's a rhythm. Like breathing. You don't stop breathing because no one thanks you for it. Every Sunday, without fail, he sent Lily a text. Sometimes it was just, "Hope your week's off to a good start." Other times, he'd share something small. A photo of a dog he saw wearing sunglasses. A memory of her as a kid trying to bake cookies and setting off the smoke alarm. He never asked for replies. But more often than not, she'd send one back. Short at first, then longer. Once, she even sent a voice note. Just her laughing at a joke her professor made in class. He listened to it 3 times before saving it. He never pushed. Never showed up unannounced again. He let trust grow at its own pace. Like a plant you water, but don't yank from the soil to check the roots. At the outreach center, he'd become a regular. Not just on weekends, but whenever his schedule allowed. Marisol still ran the kitchen like a quiet general, but now she'd sometimes step back and let him take the lead. stirring the stew, handing out trays, remembering who liked extra bread. He wasn't the guy doing court hours anymore. He was just Daniel, and that felt like enough. One afternoon, a young man came in, early 20s, eyes hollow, clothes too thin for the season. He stood by the door like he wasn't sure he belonged. Daniel recognized that look. He'd worn it himself not so long ago. Without thinking, he walked over. "First time?" he asked, not as an authority but as someone who'd been there. The young man nodded. "Soup's good today," Daniel said, "and the coffee's strong. Come on." He didn't offer advice. Didn't say, "I know how you feel." He just sat with him while he ate, asked about his name, listened when the young man haltingly shared that he'd lost his job and his apartment in the same week. Later, as the young man left, he turned and said, "Thanks for seeing me." Daniel just nodded. "We're all we've got," he said softly, echoing words he'd once heard and now lived. Back home, his room was still small, still bare, but it no longer felt empty. He'd hung a single photo on the wall, one of Lily as a child sitting on his shoulders at the zoo, both of them grinning like the world was made just for them. He hadn't looked at it in years. Now it was the first thing he saw when he woke up. He'd also started leaving his door open when he was home, just a crack, not because he expected company, but because he didn't want to live like he was hiding anymore. He still had hard days, days when the weight of the past pressed down like a stone on his chest, days when he scrolled through old photos and wondered if he'd ever truly make up for the years he missed. But now, instead of numbing the pain or pretending it wasn't there, he'd sit with it, make tea, write in his notebook, sometimes call his sponsor, not to fix it, just to say it out loud. And slowly the pain lost its sharp edges. It didn't disappear, but it became part of him, like a scar that reminds you survived. One rainy evening, he got a call from Lily, not a text, a real call. He almost didn't answer, afraid it was bad news, but he did. "Hey," she said. Her voice was calm, but there was something underneath. Nervousness, maybe hope. "Hey," he replied, heart already racing. "I got accepted into the summer internship program," she said. "The one I told you about, with the youth outreach group." "That's amazing," he said, and meant it. "I'm really proud of you." She was quiet for a beat. Then, "They need volunteers for the orientation weekend." I told them my dad might help. He froze. "You did?" "Yeah," she said, voice softer now. "If you want to." "No pressure," he swallowed. "I'd love to." They made plans. Simple ones. He'd meet her at the community center Saturday morning. Wear comfortable shoes. Bring a water bottle. The night before, he didn't sleep much. Not from anxiety, but from something like awe. He wasn't being asked to be a hero. Just a dad. Just a person showing up. Saturday morning, he arrived early. Stood outside the building, hands in his pockets, watching people come and go. Young volunteers, kids with backpacks, staff with clipboards. Then he saw her. She spotted him too. Walked over, not running, not hesitating, just walking. "You came," she said. "Yeah," he said. "I did." She smiled, small but real. "Good." They spent the day setting up chairs, handing out name tags, helping kids find their groups. He didn't hover, didn't try to impress. He just did the work, the same way he did at the outreach kitchen. Steady, present. At one point, a little girl dropped her lunchbox and burst into tears. Lily started to go to her, but Daniel was closer. He knelt, picked it up, and handed it back. "All your snacks are still in there," he said gently. "Even the apple." The girl sniffled, nodded, and ran off. Lily watched him. "You're good with kids." "I used to be," he said. "Guess some things stick." She didn't say anything for a moment. "Then you don't have to be perfect to be a good dad." He looked at her. "I'm learning that." Later, as they packed up, she asked, "Do you ever wonder what God thinks about all this? Us trying, failing, trying again?" He thought for a moment. "I think he's not angry at the trying, or even the failing. I think he's sad when we stop trying because we're ashamed, or when we pretend we've got it all together while everyone else is drowning." She nodded slowly. "Yeah, that makes sense." They walked to the bus stop together. The sun had come out, weak but warm. "You coming next weekend?" she asked. "If you want me to." "I do." And just like that, something shifted, not with fireworks, but with a quiet click, like a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for years. Life didn't magically get easier after that. Rent was still tight. Some deliveries still went wrong. Some days still felt heavy. But Daniel no longer waited for a sign that he was fixed. He'd stopped looking for perfection altogether, because he'd realized something. Peace isn't the absence of struggle. It's the presence of truth. He wasn't a saint. He wasn't even recovered in some final polished way. He was just a man, flawed, trying, learning to show up without a mask. And in that honesty, he found something he hadn't known he was searching for. Not redemption exactly, but connection. Not just with Lily, but with strangers, with himself, with the quiet pulse of something greater that moved through everyday kindness like a current. One evening, sitting on his fire escape with a cup of tea, he looked out at the city, the lights, the noise, the millions of people all carrying their own invisible weights. And for the first time, he didn't feel alone in his. He thought back to that rainy night under the bus shelter when he'd asked God what angered him most. He didn't get a voice from the sky, but over time, through small moments and quiet teachers and the courage to be real, he'd found the answer anyway. It wasn't the mistakes. It wasn't the stumbles. It was the refusal to reach out. The choice to turn away from each other. The lie that we're alone in our pain. And the antidote wasn't grand gestures. It was showing up, listening, saying me too, leaving gloves on a bench, texting your kid on Sundays, stirring the pot when no one's watching. That was it. Not perfection, just presence. And as the city hummed below him, Daniel took a slow sip of tea, leaned back against the railing, and let himself simply be human, imperfect, and finally, deeply at peace.